Hey everybody, this is Dream, and today we're going to have a nice, sizable 10-game slate here for the main slate on DraftKings. I won't be doing a FanDuel video today, but overall, this particular slate looks pretty good. We have some good pitching options, and we hopefully have some good teams to target. Cleveland, Chicago White Sox, Seattle, Houston, all look like they're in great spots. You could also take a look at Miami and Atlanta as well. So lots of good options team-wise here. So let's get into the pitchers first to start with. And first of all, we're going to look at Dylan Case for the Chicago White Sox. He's been at about 22 fantasy points for the last 10 games, and he's had 3 games against Detroit where he's had 23, 26, and 26. So he's definitely the top option on this particular slate. I think he's in a great spot, and I think he'll have a good game here. He has had a couple off games lately, but overall, he's in a great spot here and should have a pretty good chance to get over 25 points. Then we're going to look at Luis Castillo for Seattle. Now, he is averaging 21 points for the last 10 games, and he hasn't played Kansas City, but he has had 2 bad games versus Oakland, otherwise dominating most of his opponents as of late in the last 12 or 13 games. Overall, he's just been pretty solid. Like I said, Oakland, for some reason, he's had 2 games against Oakland that he's had under 10 fantasy points, but every other game he's been over that since 622 against Cincinnati. So overall, I like him in this situation against Kansas City. They don't have a ton of good hitters, so they do have a couple, but he's kind of in a really good spot here. Then we're going to look at Christian Javier for Houston against Baltimore. He's been pretty good, 20 fantasy points a game for the last 10. He's had a couple off games, and he had 1 bad game against Baltimore at 8.4, but he's still in a good spot here against Baltimore, where he can kind of have a bounce back from his previous game against them. Then we're going to look at Freddie Peralta, who looks like he's coming back from his injured list stay, and for the last 10 games he's averaging 15.7, but he's had 2 games against Cincinnati this season, and both of them were over 19 fantasy points. One was 19 fantasy points and the other was 26, and they were actually back-to-back here, so you can see those right here on the screen. Overall, I think he's a pretty decent play today. Obviously doesn't have the strikeout upside of some of the other guys, but the fact he's able to score 20 points against Cincinnati, even at Cincinnati, that gives him some upside in this particular matchup. Then we're going to look at Cabrera from Miami against Washington. Washington's not very good, and he had a 20-point game against Washington this season. He's been a little up and down, and he doesn't have as much upside as some of the other guys, but he's still in a pretty good spot here. The only real downside with him is the strikeout situation. But if you need to save money, he's somebody to take a look at. So let's go and get into the catchers that I like today. And there's really only a few catchers that are in really good spots here. And one of those is Gary Sanchez. Where'd he go? Jeez, Pete. Gary Sanchez. There he is. Sorry about that. So he's been he's had some trouble hitting the ball as of late, but he got a big game yesterday. And so he's also been extremely good against the Angels this season, and they're just going to give him more opportunities in these games. He hasn't been good as of late, but he might have just gotten himself out of the slump. He's had a few hits in the last few games, and so I think he's in a pretty decent spot here against Suarez. Then we're going to look at Atlanta and Travis d'Arnaud. If he starts, then he's definitely going to be a top option here against Gibson. He's averaging 7 fantasy points a game, hitting .315, and he is kind of due for another home run. He's still at 18 home runs, while Contreras is at 20. And that will bring up Contreras, who's the other option here for Atlanta, who just hit his 20th home run yesterday, and he's had 3 home runs the last 10 as well. Either one of these guys are in good spots here against Philadelphia. And then finally, JT Realmuto for Philadelphia is in a good spot here against Morton. He's been pretty solid against Atlanta this season, and he's averaging almost 12 fantasy points a game for the last 10. And I think he's in a good spot here to have a good game. Then we're going to look at first base, and we're going to check out Carlos Santana for Seattle. He's averaging 10 fantasy points a game for the last 10, but he's extremely boomer bust, and so you do have to take that into consideration. But his price point is inexpensive, so if you need to save money, he's somebody you can do it with. Ty France is in a great spot here for Seattle as well, averaging 9.3 fantasy points a game, and he's averaging 16 a game against Kansas City so far this season. So he's actually in a really great spot, and he's got a nice plus pitcher to go up against. Let's see here. What did I do wrong here? Hang on. Oh yeah, okay, never mind. I'm sorry. Then I got Jose Miranda for Minnesota, who's going up against Suarez of the Angels. Now, he hasn't been hitting the ball quite as well, but he looks like he's starting to hit the ball again after having a couple bad games. He went 3 for 5 yesterday, and he's in a good spot here in a plus matchup. I thought maybe Minnesota was kind of scraping at the bottom of the barrel lately, but it seems like they're going to get going again. Nathaniel Lowe is a guy I really like for Texas against Citadel. He's averaging almost 6.5 fantasy points a game, but he's hitting the ball pretty well, and so this is what you want with him. He hasn't been good against Cleveland, though, this season, but every game he is scoring some points. And then we're going to look at Luis Reyes from Minnesota, another guy who's been kind of not great lately, but he's finally having some good games the last couple where he's getting hits. And so it's just a matter of time before he has another big game. He hits too well to really have too many bad games in a row. Then we're going to look at Josh Naylor for Cleveland. He's in a really good spot here. He's also averaging almost 10 fantasy points a game. Despite the fact that he had 0 yesterday, he's been hitting the ball pretty well lately and having a lot of good games as of late. At second base, we have some good options from Minnesota. The first being Colton Wong. He's been hitting the ball pretty good. The other day against Cincinnati, he had 2 home runs. And he's had 4 home runs the last 10. And so I think he's in a great spot here to have another big game. And I meant 3 home runs, not 2, against Cincinnati. But he's been good in almost every game against them. And he's still at under $4,000, which is really nice here. Excuse me. Then we're going to look at Luis Reyes from Milwaukee as well. If he does play, then he's in a great spot here against Cincinnati. He's had 2 decent games. He's been hitting the ball. He hasn't had some big games yet, really, but he is somebody that can have big games, and when he does, it's definitely going to pay off because his price is pretty inexpensive. Then Von Grisham for Atlanta. He's not hit the ball all that great as of late, but he is starting to get out of a slump again that he was in, and he's still hitting the ball well enough that you can rely on him to score you some fantasy points in a very nice plus matchup. Andres Jimenez is another guy I like here for Cleveland. He's hitting almost 360 and 10 fantasy points a game. He had a really big game yesterday, and he's had 4 really good games against Texas this season. He's been on a roll as of late, and so he's somebody I really like at this position. And then Kevin Newman for, Pittsburgh. He's hitting almost 7 fantasy points a game the last 10, and he's in a good spot here against Chicago, who he's had a really solid season against. At third base, we have Yoan Moncada. Now, he didn't have a great game yesterday, but he's still averaging 8.3 for the last 10, and he's been good against Detroit this season. It's just, and I thought yesterday they were going to kind of explode because of the weak pitching. They've faced a lot of really good pitchers as of late, the White Sox have, but they didn't quite get it going yesterday, but they might be able to get it going today. Gio Urshela is another guy I really like here from Minnesota. He's hitting really well. He had a 17-point game yesterday. He's not a huge home run threat, but he's been hitting the ball pretty good, and he's been great against the Angels this season, almost 13 fantasy points a game, and as you can tell, he's had some good hitting games as of late. And then we're going to look at Jose Ramirez for Cleveland against Texas. He's been hitting 9.2 fantasy points a game, but his batting average is not ideal. But he has the potential to have big games, and especially against Texas when they're not throwing their best pitchers out there. And then Austin Riley has been, he's finally out of his slump, and it's just a matter of time before he hits another home run. And so I think he's got a really good solid option here against Philadelphia, who he's been pretty good against. He only has 1 home run on the season against them, but being at Philadelphia, he's done good against that in the past. So he's had 2 or 3 games where he scored at least 8 fantasy points this week against Philly, and I think he'll continue to do that as well. At shortstop, we have one of our cheaper options here as of Dylan Moore, who's been really solid as of late, averaging 7 fantasy points, hitting .316. The only real issue with him is sometimes he gets pinch hit for, but he's been good as of late, and sometimes he doesn't play as well. But again, he's been really solid when he does play. And then we're going to look at Elvis Andrus for Chicago White Sox. Now, he has cooled off a little bit from the extremely good hitting he was doing, but he's still hitting the ball well enough to be considered in this particular situation against the plus pitcher of Detroit. Then we're going to look at Ahmad Rosario, who's averaging, I think it's around 14 fantasy points a game, hitting .363, and then having 2 home runs and 2 triples in those games. He's one of my favorite plays on this particular slate. He's also just dominated Texas this season. And then finally, at this position, Dansby Swanson for Atlanta. He's finally starting to get going again after being in a bit of a slump. And yesterday, Matt Olson was able to get a day off. And I think that he'll start hitting the ball better now that now that Atlanta seems like they're out of the little rut that they were in for 4 games. In the outfielder situation, we have quite a few options. Brian Anderson's the first guy I like. He's been hitting the ball a lot better than he started the season at, and he's hitting some home runs here and there. And so while he does have a little bit of a boom or bust feeling to him, he has a better situation. He's in a great situation here against bad pitching. A.J. Pollock has really started hitting the ball well for Chicago. He's averaging 7.1 the last 10 games. Even though his batting average isn't great, he's still getting lots of fantasy points every couple games. And so that's the type of guy I like to roster in these situations. And then we're going to look at T.J. Friedl, who hasn't been as good as he was for a while, but he's still averaging almost 6 fantasy points a game, and his price is cheap enough. And he's playing in Cincinnati against Milwaukee. And then Stephen Kwan is in a good spot here for Cleveland. Now, I think his price is a little bit high for what his production is. Even though he's averaging 12 fantasy points a game, he doesn't really have a home run threat. And he hasn't been that great against Texas this season, and even in the last 2 games. But he's still in a really nice plus opportunity against bad pitching. Oscar Gonzalez for Cleveland is in a great spot here as well. He's averaging 7.3 fantasy points a game for the last 10. He actually hit 2 home runs yesterday, and he's been hitting the ball pretty well as of late. He's had a bunch of 7-point games, 8-point games, 6-point games, etc. And so if he can have another home run, that will definitely be useful here. Mitch Haniger has not hit the ball well as of late, only 3.4 the last 10 games. But he finally had a game yesterday and a couple games ago where he got some points, and he was getting walked a lot. And so it's just a matter of time before he hits another home run. Eloy Jimenez has been absolutely great lately, averaging 9 fantasy points a game, including a home run yesterday. He's also had 2 home runs the last 10. He's been pretty solid against Detroit at 8.6 fantasy points a game. He is a little bit pricey, but if you can afford him, then he'll probably pay off. Hunter Renfroe has also been hitting pretty well at almost 9 fantasy points a game. He had a massive game in his last game against Cincinnati with 42 fantasy points with 2 home runs. I don't think that he'll replicate that, but in Cincinnati, he's still in the play to get a potential another home run, or at least score a decent chunk of fantasy points. And then Christian Yelich is also in a great spot for Milwaukee, though he hasn't been hitting quite as well, but he still has some upside in this matchup in a plus ballpark. Ian Happ is a guy I really like today against Ortiz of Pittsburgh. He's somebody that I like to roster on typical situations. Now, he has been very kind of boom or bust lately, but he's in that situation where he has boom potential. And then finally, Taylor Ward for the Angels is in a good spot here against Bundy. He's averaging almost 11 fantasy points a game, and his price is just too cheap for his potential production. He's also averaged 10 fantasy points a game against the Minnesota Twins this season. So I think he's in a great spot. Overall, I think we have a really solid set of players today. You could also take a look at Trout, obviously, and Menezes for Washington and stuff. But overall, I think we have a solid set of games here, and I think that it'll be pretty easy to make a pretty good roster out of it. pitching is definitely not going to be as good as it has been. Granted, yesterday pitching wasn't very good overall, but I still think this slate is probably a little bit weaker on the pitching situations just because of the matchups. But overall, I think it's still a good slate, and I think you're going to be able to find some opportunity here in order to make a really good lineup. So with that said, thank you guys again for liking, commenting, subscribing, and have a nice day, guys.